All right, welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Schirch and I'm one of the co-chairs for the Alliance for Peacebuilding Community of Practice on Digital Peacebuilding. This is one of our monthly events for June. And today we are featuring a book that the 6 of us here who are on the Zoom screen for you have worked on together with about 8 other people. My name again is Lisa Schirch. I work for the Toda Peace Institute, and this book that we're talking about today was sponsored by the Toda Peace Institute, which is a peace think tank based in Tokyo, Japan. And the title of our book, Social Media Impacts on Conflict and Democracy, began as a series of policy briefs several years ago. We commissioned 13 authors, and we have 5 of them with us today sharing. So we'll have Iria Puyosa talk about Venezuela, Sabine talk about Egypt, Diana Ishaqat talk about Jordan, Diana Dajer talk about Colombia, and Fredrick Ogenga talk about Kenya. So I'm going to begin by giving sort of a conceptual overview of the book, and then each of the authors will talk a little bit about their particular country-based case study, and then hopefully we will have 30 minutes of time for questions and conversation. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and as we go along. So we're going to give all of our presentations and then open it up. And I want to let everybody know that we are recording today's session. All right, so I'm going to begin with my own screen here. And
please. Yeah, everything's in the chat.
I think we may need to, Linda from the Alliance for Peacebuilding is helping us. If you can help mute everybody else on the call so that we don't hear their background noise. Thank you. All right, so the Toda Peace Institute, the book, I've given a little bit of explanation about that. Really, the big idea is that we see a shift in conversation about how social media is impacting our world, sort of the balance between the techno-optimism, thinking that social media and other technologies are going to improve information access, empower democracy, free up our speech so that more of us can speak freely. And then, of course, in the last 5 years, particularly since 2016, there has just been a range of bad news about the impact of social media technology on authoritarian surveillance, on disinformation, on polarization, on violent extremism. And the case studies that we wanted to gather from around the world were from countries that we have not heard about so much, particularly in the West, where a lot of the focus has been on the impact of social media on the US context or in Europe. So we wanted to have case studies from Latin America, Africa, Asia, and we picked also Northern Ireland as sort of conflict-affected contexts. And how is social media sort of meeting the realities of the dynamics that were already happening in many countries around the world. So the countries here in red are where the case studies in the book are from. And what we found is that social media is having a wide range of negative impacts around the world, amplifying disinformation, increasing polarization, spreading violent extremist material, really bolstering authoritarianism, undermining democracy in some places. We also really recorded that there is an untapped potential for digital peace building in each of these countries as well. There are already democracy activists coordinating and working together to address corruption, to address polarization, but these sort of are beginning and usually small efforts. The conceptual framework really looks at sort of this relationship between information, peace, social cohesion, and you can say democracy, and that there's sort of this virtuous cycle where when we have media and citizen journalists and quality information, these contribute to peace and social cohesion and also democracy. And when we have information disorders, which is a term really for false or misleading information, this contributes to polarization, violent conflict, and authoritarianism. part of what's happened with social media is that there's been this rapid change in how news gets out to the public. So in the traditional news media model, you had a journalist writing stories, you had gatekeepers who were the media owners, and they had influence over the news editors. And then the editors picked the stories that went out to the public. The benefit of this model is that disinformation cannot get through these gates as easily because media owners can be sued for publishing false information. So you have accountability built into this structure of gatekeeping, where the downside, of course, of this model is that citizen journalists cannot report on their own context, cannot sort of reach the broader public. Social media communication has fundamentally shifted how people are communicating around the world. So now anybody around the world can communicate with anybody else. And there's these 12 different S words, we call them, sort of these unique characteristics of social media communication that really is twisting the way humanity is communicating with others. So, you know, one person in India can spread a rumor instantly on social media that reaches millions of people across the country, and leads to the instant deaths of people because of a false rumor. And we saw that pattern happening in a number of the case studies in the book. I'm not going to go thoroughly into these models, just give you a little bit of a taste of the conceptual framework. So, you know, we really also looked at not only is the communication system different, but the economic model of social media platforms is distinct, where you have people really shaping the market economy over private information. So the surveillance capitalism of the large social media platforms is monetizing our private activity. The design of these platforms is to monetize our attention. And so they're designed to keep us on the platforms as long as possible. And then the algorithms that are used to show us what information will keep us longer is often the most outrageous, often the false information. We know already that disinformation travels 6 times as fast as truth on social media. MIT researchers found that, and that's human beings sharing false information. It's not including all the bots and foreign operatives that are also out there sort of manipulating what information is shared on social media. So some people are calling social media platforms these outrage and polarization machines, where the algorithms seem to amplify the most extreme emotional content. Also, people are talking about information gerrymandering. So information is not flowing freely. Algorithms calculate what people want to see, what will keep them on the platforms longer. And of course, our brains already are subconsciously wanting to avoid information that contradicts our beliefs. So the algorithms are giving people really different information. So this is just a taste of some of the case studies in the book, and sort of checking the boxes of what the local researchers were finding in terms of how social media communication affects political campaigns and elections, how it fuels violence against individuals in some situations, increases polarization, leading to larger scale violence. Obviously, non-state terror groups are using social media to build support, to spread propaganda. Governments are doing the same, but also governments are clamping down on how democracy activists are using social media. So each of the case studies also looks at the social media laws that are happening in so many countries to limit free speech. In places like Venezuela, we'll hear about sort of government surveillance, and in some places, you know, repression from the government versus social media troll farms that are really repressing civil society space. The quick overview of this whole model is, you know, you have this these black boxes, which are the unique things that social media communication offers. And then the social media platforms like Twitter, like Facebook in particular, WhatsApp, et cetera, have an economic model that even twists that further. And these tech engines, they're falling on our vulnerable brains. So the neuroscience of how our We take in communication. They fall on vulnerable societies. We already had polarization before social media came. And we have had vulnerable institutions, particularly democratic institutions. And what we're seeing is this is leading to a whole host of impacts all over the world, which is why the subtitle for the book is The Tectonic Shift, which is a play on that word tectonic. This is a tremendous shift in how people engage in conflict behavior. The book also, each of the chapters, the authors touch on what is a multi-stakeholder peace-building plan to engage tech companies, governments, and civil society to reduce cyber conflict and to increase digital peace-building. And so now I'm going to pass it off to my colleagues. We'll start with Iria, then Fredrick, Sabine, Diana, and then another Diana, to tell us a little, give us a little bit of a taste of what is happening in their countries so that we get a sense of this global impact. I'm going to ask each of the participants to introduce themselves because they wear a number of different hats. Iria, I will pass it over to you. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. It's my pleasure to be here in the launch of our book, Social Media Impacts on Conflict and Democracy. I'm going to share my screen right now wait a second. It's always complicated to navigate this. I'm losing you.
Just introduce yourself.
Yes, no, I just looking for the button to share my screen. Well, I'm Iria Puyosa. I'm originally from Venezuela. I work as a researcher, mostly on political communication and social media and politics. I have been working in information disorders for about 7 years now. Also working with social movements used in the internet, social media for mobilization. So kind of looking at both sides, the side with the movements and the side of the government repression. I'm going to focus on the Venezuelan case. So let me share my screen with you. Yes, slideshow. Okay. So my chapter is on Venezuelan digital authoritarianism. One of my points is Venezuela was kind of early on the game of using the internet for repressing civil society. We start seeing the initial signs of this like 2009. I'm going to just mention 3 lines in which this had been happening. So in order to be really, really brief, because we don't have much time. So the first trend is decriminalization online speech. We have seen what we call lawfare since very early. Venezuela was trying to pass legislation to control online speech since as early as 2004. But most of that legislation didn't pass until 2010, because at the time it was, at the beginning, there was a national legislative body who kind of stopped it to happen. But when the Chavismo became a complete majority, they were able to pass those laws. So we had the lawfare element. In Venezuela, we had something called, as an example, a law for against hatred, was actually a law who punished people for talking against the government. Most of the people have been prosecuted on that law, have been journalists or social activists, but even regular citizens have been judicialized under this law. We also had a kind of widespread censorship of websites, digital media with adversarial to the government, some independent digital media, national, but also international media who reports on Venezuela can be accessed within the countries without a VPN. We had what we call just-in-time temporal blocking of social media platform in time of some contested political events like civil unrest, massive demonstration, or sometimes when the opposition leaders want to make an important announcement. In those cases, we had been suffering blocking of Twitter, Periscope, Instagram, Facebook, and also YouTube. And so we had an instance of having Wikipedia blocked for a few days to prevent people from knowing how internationally we're seeing the events of Venezuela early 2019. We have seen events of phishing from the government agency of telecommunications, phishing democratic organization websites in order to get the data from their volunteers. Another important is we're seeing is the one having spent the most time researching, maybe not the most important, but it's kind of my passion, is information warfare. As I mentioned, we started to see information disorders in Venezuela in the middle of 2009. And in 2010, President Hugo Chavez started a big program to take over Twitter communications. They organized, coordinated to deploy information on Twitter mainly, but also in blogs and media forums, and a huge the coordinated campaign to flood pro-government propaganda in social media. That was very early, and most of the people around the world weren't paying attention to social media at the time. That the attention started as the Arab Spring, and of course, as the 2016 foreign intervention in United States elections. But for us, that was something common since early 2010. Disinformation strategies have been contaminated online environment and generating chaos in Venezuela. That phenomenon of gerrymandering Lisa was referring to is something we have been living for more than 10 years now. There are also in the last maybe 5 years, we have seen how the Venezuelan government information warfare apparatus have been targeting operations to other Latin American countries, such like Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, also United States and Spain. So it's kind of, it's one of the most biggest information warfare apparatus for a government in the world. Is considered one of the top 5 for independent researchers in Europe. The third way, and this is maybe the most problematic, the most difficult for everyone, is the surveillance of our citizens. We have something that's called the Homeland System. This is a registration for the Venezuelan population to access welfare. People had to register in the system in order to purchase scarce foods directly from the government distribution, to get medicines for catastrophic illness, to collect their social security pensions, and even more recently to filling gas, subsidized prices. A rich oil country had to do gasoline, combustibles are rationing. People need to have to even pay international prices who are well beyond their pockets, or getting toward the Homeland System. More than half of the population is there. Maybe by now, it was more than half when we wrote the book 2 years ago, but now it's close to 90% of the population, because it's needed for the gas, it's needed for medicines. More recently, it's needed for getting in the list to have the chance to get COVID-19 vaccines. This is the most recent development. So if you are not registered in the Homeland System, you won't be allowed to get a vaccine. That is what configures what we have been calling the digital authoritarianism, which is established in Venezuela in these last 10 years. I think you had an overall picture of what's going on. I didn't go on to the good side. As I said, Venezuelans were very early in the social media. Civil society movements have been there since earlier than the government. In 2009, it was already a movement using social media, especially blogs and Twitter, for mobilization and expressing online. And nowadays is just the only available media for expressing opinions that are adversarial to the government. Well, thank you. I hope I didn't pass my time.
Thank you so much. Fredrick, are you ready to present?
Yes, I am ready.
Okay.
Yep.
The floor is yours.
All right. I'm gonna sit. I don't have a slide to show, but I think I'll just talk from my backyard, from the forest. There, you can see the trees behind me. It's good to see everyone around, and it's good to have this conversation all the way virtually from Kenya. And as we speak, I would want to really appreciate the book and the title that really a very able editor chose for it, Tectonic Shift. And I'd really want to really agree with that title, that it's really actually the tectonic shift, because what this book has done, the journey of writing this book and book chapter, we took some of us all the way to San Diego, the Kroc Peace Institute, as we developed the chapters and obviously presented our policy briefs there. We came out there guns blazing. And some of those ideas we learned are increasingly transforming the way we see reality around ourselves, especially in the context of digital media technologies. And this has slightly shifted the level of attention we had and some of the things we took for granted when it comes to issues of media, mediation, messaging, democracy, and also the idea of the citizen and the transformative self, where somebody is transformed from the physical self, the virtual self, and the space they have between themselves and reality that is out there. All these things are what we are contesting with today. And in my book chapter, my argument is that Kenya has had a very clear trajectory of media development. Initially, we used to have our political news from mainstream media. And in the 90s, we had channels that were simply controlled by the government. They're actually mouthpieces of the government. And there was little much conversations that citizens would have with the regimes that were there, simply sending messages from top to the bottom. Well, that changed. I mean, and that changed with the emergence of new spaces that were brought about by telecommunication giants, and companies like Safaricom, Airtel, Telcom, and other tech companies like Huawei and counting. When these technologies came into the new media landscape, then many Kenyans began owning cell phones, and the information environment was a little bit liberalized. But with that came a lot of changes in the way citizens respond to governments and to politicians. And increasingly from 2007, we saw a slight shift from how citizens want to interact on media platforms. Before 2007, prior to 2007, we had mainstream media actually accused of instigating violence. So Kenya had a serious violence occasion in 2007, 2008 that was actually fueled via vernacular radio stations. But prior to that, really social media was not very active. But post 2007, we saw Kenyans really trying to forge ahead by coming up with a way in which they can engage their citizens with a constitution that speaks to their reality. So we ended up changing our constitution in 2010, and we had a new constitution. And that constitution also meant information freedom to impart and share information in the Information Act. And of course, that also enabled Kenyans to have some level of freedom in how they want to share and disseminate information. But now the problem now translated itself from mainstream media to social media platforms. So social media platforms became the new public spheres where Kenyans went and debated about things that matter to them when it comes to political elections, democracy, participation, issues of rights and citizenship. And that kind of discussion escalated very well somewhere prior to main general elections. So in 2013, which was the first election after the promulgation of the new constitution, we saw a lot of activism online. We saw a lot of participation online where Kenyans had a lot of conflicting views about how they want to see Kenya reorganizing itself in terms of governance and other things. And that's where we saw ugly things happening. So because we saw people polarizing themselves along ethnic mentalities. So we saw what was happening prior to 2007, because it was happening offline, it was now escalated online, where people debated and polarized themselves in terms of political extremism on views of how Kenya needs to move forward in terms of leadership, presidency, and what have you. So Kenyans were polarized along ethnic lines, and that kind of polarization led to some level of tensions and violence, although not to the extent that was witnessed in 2008. So that being the case, moving forward to 2017, we had our last general elections. We saw a lot of things happening. We not only saw the negative part of aspects of social media, but we also began seeing a number of positive things that social media could do. In other words, social media was being used to mobilize people to take their government into account for accountability. We saw citizens being educated on social media. We saw citizens being informed in a big way in how they need to be very cautious when they want to vote, the kind of leaders they needed to vote in, and so on. But beyond that, we saw a citizens that was increasingly dissented with the manner in which the government carried out the elections and how they wanted to govern. So we saw what I would easily call virtual people's assemblies, where people gathered online and put the government to pressure to the extent that they boycotted the repeat election that was called as a result of a contested election that was nullified by the Supreme Court. And beyond that, we saw citizens claiming their rights back and their space back by wanting to secede in terms of organizing themselves online and claiming that some parts of Kenya is not Kenya. And the government got scared, you know? So over time, we've seen a government that has become a little bit cautious, throwing in cybersecurity laws so that they can tame that kind of uprisals that is coming up from citizens genuinely on the ground, and with the idea that they can generate content and contest what they have in State House or in Nairobi. So the question we ask ourselves is that if citizens now have this level of power in terms of contesting and competing with discourses that are emerging from those in power positions, then what are we seeing going forward? We are seeing the potential of a country that can explode in chaos, especially ethnic violence, if this kind of space is not properly deliberated. So in other words, what the book and the book chapter also informed me is that really we need a multi-stakeholder engagement when it comes to how we want to engage people and citizens on social media platforms, which might really call for literacy programs, social media literacy programs. And that is where we are now. We are really actively engaging citizens and educating them and telling them social media is not just what you see. It's not just posting a video on TikTok and celebrating. It's more than what you see. So we are actually exposing the social media algorithms and what Lisa described, the surveillance economy, and also the attention economy, so that people can know that there's some ways that you can positively exploit social media, or there are some ways that you can also negatively exploit social media with some level of consequences. And this is what we put up to them. And we are hoping that that journey will continue so that we make Kenyans aware that social media spaces are a double-edged sword, depending on how you want to utilize them. And therefore, social media can be deliberately used positively to advance democracy.
Thank you very much, Fredrick. For time's sake, we need to pass on to the next person. Thank you. Sabine from Egypt, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. I join my colleagues in being grateful to be here. I'm Sabine. I'm a freelance journalist, mainly working on North Africa. The chapter the case study that I worked on was mainly on Egypt and social media in Egypt. And perhaps you already know that social media in Egypt is usually synonymous with the Arab Spring and the protests that happened in 2011. Apart from the fact that it was a revolution held on social media platforms, a lot of change later on happened because of these platforms. The issue is that as Egypt as a new regime came to appear, Egypt basically lost more of its freedom. So on a freedom scale, it's actually 26 out of 100 due to like obstacles to access, the limited content, violations of human rights, and we can talk a lot about that, but like one of the examples of limiting access to Egyptians would be that they were limiting some human rights websites like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty. In fact, the Toda Institute was blocked in Egypt for quite some time till just recently. There has been, though, a huge shift in technology between now and a decade ago. Not just because of like the features or the new platforms that came, but because of having it very close to or at our disposal. I just want to remind you of how it started in Egypt. It was a video or a footage actually of a young man that was killed by the police. Somebody started a social media page, and this is how it escalated. The problem is that by the year 2018, there were a lot of attacks on freedoms, and all of these attacks were consolidated by a social media law called the Anti-Cyber Information Technology Crimes Law, which stipulates basically that if you have 5,000 followers or above, you are a media account. Of course, with that comes censorship and arrests, and we, like up until recently, we've been having like 20 and 19-year-olds being arrested for dancing on TikTok. Whereas the country, when the country was trying to kind of enact that anti-cyber law, they were trying to stop ISIS from recruiting people, because they try to do that on Twitter through just hijacking certain hashtags. But instead, they are using it to curtail human rights, and the recruitment is still ongoing. In fact, in 2015, even though Twitter blocked around 380,000 sympathizers, there were other accounts that basically came out with and generated almost 1 billion tweets that are mainly just loyal to ISIS. The civil society should be the #1 stakeholder in this, in trying to work and present the challenges faced by the least privileged, and trying to increase the civil society training to improve personal safety. But sadly, there are a lot of reasons why that is not happening. There is no social upheaval, and basically the left is more divided on minor issue than it is than they are united on this one big issue. In the case of extremism, developing open web protocols to govern online space could have helped and could still help, providing a fact-based information ecosystem and working directly with basically Facebook, Twitter, in order to have like that collaboration and making sure that they are reading the messages correctly. But what happens is that Facebook and Twitter, they both tried to basically govern online or social media accounts, or they try to help as much as they can. But the problem is that we have a number of dialects, even within the same country. And when they tried to collaborate with other people, those other people were mainly on the conservative or extremist side. So it didn't help. It actually backfired. And there are a lot of examples on that. I would also mention that social media outlets, they have another role, which is to change their privacy approach and not control basically or create unconstrained freedoms on social media or make more gateways and centralized ecosystems. And since the public basically turns to social media to consume news, a fact-based information center is important, and this has been a call by many, many people over the years, and we still do ask these social media platforms to work with us directly, but they get suspicious, and like I said, they try to basically make business with the wrong kind of people. Thanks, Lisa, and thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Sabine. We'll pass it to Diana Ishaqat.
Hello, everyone. I'll just take a moment to share my screen, and thanks a lot for being here. I will start sharing my slides. Could you confirm that you could see them?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, great. So welcome to everyone here. My name is Diana. I'm making this presentation from Amman, Jordan. I'm a former Chevening scholar with a master's in media, campaigning, and social change. I currently work in education for employment in the Arab states, specializing in advanced computing majors such as AI, cybersecurity, software engineering, and software development. Sorry, just a moment. I'll share a little bit about Jordan. I'm confident that it's not very familiar to everyone. Jordan is considered to be an upper middle income nation. The current population is 10 million people, and this figure does not include the diverse groups of refugees who live here, including UN agencies registered and non-registered groups, such as Syrians, Palestinians, Iraqis, Yemenis, Sudanese, among others. Jordan is a close partner of the United States, of the EU, of the UK, and a broad range of other countries, but these would be, I believe, the most notable ones. And then the official language is Arabic, although English is widely understood in West Amman, as well as the workers of the international community organizations. Jordan is mostly made of Arab tribes and Arabs from nearby regions and countries, and minorities of Circassian, Chechen, Armenian, and Kurdish backgrounds. So more than 85% of the population has access to the internet. The most popular app in Jordan is Facebook, and it is followed by YouTube and Twitter. What's very interesting is that more than half of the Arabic content on the internet is produced in Jordan, making the events that happen here important for the overall internet well-being and not just that of Jordan. So internet freedoms and the current situation that activists and civil society organizations are faced with in relation to our freedoms and our rights online and digitally are highly influenced by the political heritage and history of the 1950s and the 1970s, or events leading to these dates or prior to them. They affect our rights to citizen assembly, freedom of expression, and decisions of banning certain apps and digital platforms. And this most recently included Clubhouse, that gained popularity in different parts of the world. I won't go in depth into what these events entail, but you can take a look at this timeline that includes the beginning of the war in Palestine, ending with more, let's say, conflict-based events, Black September events with the PLO, and Jordan's ban of political life, and then the revival of this political life. And there are several examples of campaigns that we follow throughout our books. And in the case of Jordan, these included the Open the Borders campaign, N308, and Withdraw the Law of Cybercrime, as well as We Are Broke or Manash. These topics kind of touch on a wide range of issues that people felt strongly towards, including when the borders with Syria were announced closed, and today remain only narrowly open. And at the height of the bombing of border cities, volunteer collectives demanded saving the civilians and organizing aid in no-man land camps. And this hashtag was very useful in getting people together to organize such initiatives. Similar to the case of Egypt, the cyber law crime until today remains problematic. It is vague, it's elastic, it's suppressive to the internet and digital rights freedoms. And it's because it's vague, it's difficult to tell if people will be influenced by it or if something that you write will be considered under it. So you would find yourself practicing self-surveillance, and so do journalists and other civil society members and just really everyday users of the internet. And below you can see examples of other campaigns, some which we explored in a better summarized way in the book. I found in the process of writing the book that it was also interesting to explore the uses of social media among non-state actors such as refugee groups, because they are important to Jordan's domestic and foreign politics. And I found that refugees used WhatsApp group, for example, the most to share and exchange information about relocation within Jordan and abroad, scholarships and funding sources, jobs and freelancing opportunities, especially that it's very difficult to secure job permits for refugees here. And then finally, they would use it to recommend trusted charities based on their own experiences. And this is where you would really know whether an organization is doing what it's promised to deliver or not. And managing these kind of branding aspects and reputation aspects gets also very important in trust building and the sustainability of such programs and organizations. Social media threats are probably also somewhat familiar to the majority of you. As has been mentioned, they are more local to certain contexts. We've also had the threat of extremist mobilization. Many accounts appear to be just ordinary users while they're being used by outside groups or even groups within Jordan to recruit vulnerable youth and populations. Hate speech is a problem, and I'll explore that in the upcoming slide. And finally, fake news and disinformation. And in the chapter of the book, I've also explored the initiatives that were mapped as part of the response to these threats and parts of the creating of solutions for such circumstances and conditions. What I really noticed, even as myself as a user, that misogyny is a problem on local social media networks. The problem gets really noticeable when the coverage of the media or the content that social media users produce has to do with women participating in protests, women participating in the creative industry, and women sharing things like their accomplishments, their startups, and so on. If you scroll down to the comment section, you would see that there are patterns in the way that these women are described, in the way that they're being publicly shamed at times. We've had a very famous case of a Netflix series whose entire cast was being bullied online because the majority of viewers thought that the series in which they appeared in did not represent conservative Jordanian values. But when you really analyze the bullying and shaming around it more, you would notice that women are being shamed for their roles, like out of proportions, completely disproportionately compared to how the show itself is being responded to. And finally, I've explored several recommendations. I included the use of digital narrative text analysis, using social media monitoring tools, natural language processing software, and also improving program outreach with alternative partnerships. And that includes the use of partnerships with youth collectives, WhatsApp groups, and Telegram communities, as well as micro-influencers, especially in the case of reaching refugees in Jordan. And finally, I believe it's important to expand the conversation on abusive content because in the local culture, unless it's something that really hurts you directly, otherwise it's not recognized, it's difficult to prove and work around. And I think that the understanding should be really expanded to different ways of viewing public shaming, stereotypes, and hidden messages recognition, especially for girls and women. More can be definitely found in the book. If any questions are there, I'm more than happy to answer them, but this would be it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to remind everyone in the audience to please use the chat function to share your questions. We're going to run out of time for a big group conversation. I want to pass it over to Diana Dajer from Colombia so we can converse on the questions in the chat box. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa, and hello, everyone. As Lisa mentioned, my name is Diana Dajer. I am a Colombian that works on public innovation to foster human rights, currently finishing a PhD in socio-legal studies at the University of Oxford. I am thrilled for being able to join you all today. And as we have heard from the previous presentations, the world is flooded with examples of how social media is being used in conflict-affected areas for better and for worse. Colombia is not an exception, and in my chapter, I analyze both cross-cutting and distinctive positive and negative effects of social media use in 3 specific democratic spaces in Colombia. I'll briefly talk about the different cases. The first one is the 2016 plebiscite to endorse a peace agreement between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrilla, which is a kind of referendum. Social media in these elections influenced citizens both during a peace process with FARC guerrilla group that started in 2012, a campaigning period for citizens to endorse or reject a peace agreement with FARC in 2016, and a later stage of renegotiations to settle a new accord. And when the plebiscite was held, the emotions triggered by social media were so dominant that a local caricaturist sarcastically proposed to use Facebook reactions on the plebiscite's ballot as a way for citizens to express their views about the agreement. And actually, the fact that the peace talks with FARC were very confidential, lengthy, and in Havana made it very easy for speculations to spread about the content of the agreement. and information and misinformation were thus widely shared through social media, and the content shared portrayed, for instance, pictures of famous people falsely rejecting or supporting the peace agreement. And both opponents and supporters of the agreement also use social media to trigger citizens' emotions to vote in favor or against the accord. For example, and this is very well known, the manager of the No campaign claimed that they wanted people to vote in rage, and supporters of the agreement also sought to mobilize people's emotions, such as through messages of hope about ending the conflict. But however, the day of the plebiscite, anger appears to be trumped over other emotions, with 50.21% of people voting against the agreement. So as you can see, public opinion was highly polarized. Still, social media also helps civil society organize to debunk disinformation, nurture dialogue between people with very diverse views, and foster mobilizations to pressure a new agreement once the original one was rejected in the ballot boxes. Now let me take you briefly to the second case, which examines the 2018 presidential elections in Colombia. In that year, Colombia held 3 national elections that for the first time in history featured FARC as a political party, and messages spread through social media platforms shared content that aimed to influence people's decisions. Polarization proved to be a successful electoral strategy in the plebiscite elections, so exploiting that division became a signature feature of many 2018 presidential campaigns. And in this divided political arena, similar to the spread of misinformation during the plebiscite's campaign, the 2018 presidential elections also feature a broad range of false viral content shared through social media. Another harmful effect of social media, in this case, are potential breaches to personal integrity, data privacy, and freedom of information rights, both of the electorate and the candidates during the campaigning and elections. But however, despite the harmful uses of social media, it also allowed citizens to have debates and discussions about the candidates, and several civil society organizations led initiatives to help the voters understand and compare available political proposals. Now let's briefly discuss the third case, which explores the threats and crimes against social leaders since the peace agreement with FARC was signed. The exclusion of social and political leaders in democratic spaces has been a constant in the Colombian conflict for decades, and since the signature of the peace agreement with FARC in 2016, threats and crimes against them have increased. Social media use has influenced both the protection and the threats of social and political leaders, and for instance, it has allowed the amplification and massification of threats against leaders and created new means to create pressure and disseminate terror. But still, social media employment has also been valuable to provide support to social leaders, amplify their messages and sufferings, and create mechanisms to prevent crimes against them. Although in the 3 cases discussed in the chapter, there are very specific dynamics and characteristics. There are 3 cross-cutting elements found in all of them, and you can see these elements also in other cases that are explored in the book. The first is, in all the cases, social media help to trigger and shape emotions of citizens with an influence on the decisions. Second, in all the cases, both information and misinformation spread through social media platforms appear to have an effect on the political choices made by the citizens in a weaponization of social media. And lastly, in the 3 events, offline polarization was mirrored and amplified online. And the beneficial and harmful effects that are portrayed spark several questions about the nature of democracy in the era of social media. So therefore, based on the cases examined, the chapter also draws recommendations for conflict transformation in democratic scenarios that may face similar situations. And to name one case, one of the main lessons in the different cases analyzed is that there is not one single silver bullet initiative that one stakeholder can implement once and for all to unleash the power of social media to foster a more open and transparent democracy in Colombia. But in contrast, as Lisa was suggesting, there is a need for a collaborative multi-stakeholder strategy that gathers different actors to implement a diverse set of projects with the same overarching objective. This is increasingly important in Colombia with the strikes that we're living at the moment nationally, and also with new elections approaching in 2022 in the midst of the current coronavirus pandemic, where most of our interactions are still digital. So this in short summarizes my chapter. Thanks, Lisa, for inviting me to be part of this study, and Alliance for Peace Building for organizing this book launch. I hope the book triggers a better use of social media to foster peace building worldwide